نعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. We seek refuge in Allah from the accursed shaitan. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, most merciful, especially merciful. Subhanaka, glory be to you, O Allah. La ilma lana, there is no knowledge for you, for us, illa ma 'allamtana, except that which you teach us. Allahumma 'allimna ma yanfa'una. O Allah, teach us that which will be beneficial for us. Wazidna ilma, and increase us in knowledge. Wa rzuqna fahma, and grant us understanding. Ya muqallib al-qulub, O changer of hearts. ثبت قلوبنا على دينك, keep our hearts firm on your deen. اللهم اجعل أعمالنا خالصة لوجهك. O Allah, grant our actions to be done sincerely for your sake. ولا تجعل فيها حظا لغيرك, and let there not be in them a portion for other than you. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Wasfiya Al-Talib, and I am your facilitator for this evening's webinar on narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. This is hosted on behalf of Muslims Connected, or I am rather presenting on behalf of our organization, Muslims Connected, which is an online educational platform. We currently have Arabic classes that are going to be starting soon, so do sign up if you've always wanted to learn Arabic, or if you are learning and want to carry on in your Arabic studies. And then we also have, these some more webinars coming up. So please follow us on Instagram at Muslims_connected to stay updated with the future webinars. And also make sure you are in one of our WhatsApp groups, so you can also stay connected over there. And then we also have one-on-one Quran teachers. So please contact us if you need a Quran teacher to help you along your Quran journey. If you have any questions during the session, please post them, or rather please put them in the Google form that is in the chat box, or will be in the chat box in a moment. And that way you will stay anonymous. And then at the end of today's session, Dr. Nahla will answer your questions. Please keep your questions on topic, otherwise they most likely will not be answered. So as for today's presenter of our webinar on narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder, we have our speaker, Dr. Nahla, who is a psychiatry resident and mental health advocate. She's passionate about health, equity, and cultural safety. She advocates strongly for victims and survivors of abuse while sharing practical tools on how to heal from that trauma. Her aim is to provide tools that helps make minority communities feel seen, supported, and represented within the field of mental health. We previously had Dr. Nahla on the topic of trauma bonds, and that was very well attended. And based on that, there were a lot of questions that came up related to narcissistic people. And so today is the promised webinar on narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. So I welcome you, Dr. Nahla. Bismillah.
Thank you for that. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for having me again for a second talk. I just want to check my audio is okay. I just switched to my earphones, so that's all good?
All good, shukran.
Okay, perfect. So I'll ask that the screen is shared for the presentation. I will have slides as I go along, but most of what I say will not be in the slides. I just have them as a way to have you follow along as we speak. So I'll ask that is shared, and then we'll check that my camera's on and everything else is good to go. And I will pin this. So while we're getting that sorted, I'll introduce the topic again really briefly, just so you know that the share screen didn't work. So I'm the only one showing. So we're going to be talking about narcissistic traits versus narcissistic personality disorder, and then we'll go into practical tools of how to manage somebody in your life that may be one or the other. And the reason for this conversation, like they said, is that it was so many questions were surrounding this topic after we talked about trauma bonds. So it is incredibly important, I think, to talk about this in particular, because we, especially with social media, tend to conflate the two, that we think that an actual personality disorder like NPD, and you'll hear me say NPD, that means narcissistic personality disorder. We conflate that with somebody who just has some traits, for example. And not to minimize how difficult it might be to deal with somebody who has the traits in general, but to say that we can't conflate the two and we can't say that they're the same, although with social media, we end up doing that. So that's why it's important to make that distinction and to understand the difference, and then look at moving forward and managing that person in our lives. So I'll go to the next slide. I want to first talk about what personality disorders are in general. And so narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, I'll start with that, is actually within a cluster of personality disorders, which are called cluster B personality disorders. We cluster them in psychiatry because of the fact that within those particular clusters, there's a lot of overlap. And it's important because somebody might present with some symptoms of one of the cluster B personality disorders and another one because it's just so common. And so we often end up even diagnosing people with cluster B personality traits because it's just so common that they overlap. And that's important because narcissism can even be mistaken for other completely different personality disorders too. So I wanted to mention that first. Generally, just to give you a brief introduction, NPD is characterized by a pattern of lacking of empathy, having a sense of entitlement to things and to people, and a need for extreme admiration. And there's like an estimation that 0.5 to 5% of the population has this disorder. The reason it's so hard to know this, and I'll explain it a lot better later on in the talk, is because a lot of people with narcissistic personality disorder don't feel there's anything wrong with them and therefore don't seek psychiatric care and therefore don't get diagnosed. So all we have are estimates based on, assumptions and stories and other people's experiences and just like the general public. We know for sure that there are more males than females that have this disorder. And we know that an individual with NPD can cause significant distress to those around them, both strangers, those who are close to them. Often the problems don't come about from the individual expressing it, but from people around them expressing it. So I'll go to the next slide and talk about the personality disorders briefly. I just want you all to know a little bit about it first before we get into the nitty-gritty of everything. And if anything is super unclear, by the way, I do want us to stop and have me clarify that, because I feel like some of this language can be very jargony and can be hard for a person who hasn't studied psychiatry to understand. So if I'm not being clear, let me know. Hosts, let me know over message, like, can you explain this word? And I will do it. We'll go to the next slide. So I wanted to show this slide because of the overlap I was talking about earlier. And this is incredibly important. So the cluster B personality disorders include antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and histrionic. So the reason I want to talk about this is because sometimes when people describe to me, they're like, oh, I think my friend or my mom or my dad or my partner is narcissistic, and they describe them to me and I'm like, actually, they sound antisocial, or actually they sound borderline, actually, that, because they just overlap so much. So I wanted us to go through this really quickly and understand why the clusters are important. So antisocial personality disorder is somebody that has a deeply ingrained and rigid dysfunctional thought process that focuses on social irresponsibility. And they're usually exploitative. They generally end up in the forensic system, which basically means like the jail system. They end up being charged. They end up kind of being in the criminal system as well. But actually, sometimes antisocial personality disorder folks end up being very successful businessmen and CEOs, or businessmen and women, I should say, and CEOs. So highly successful, but very exploitative individuals. So they can end up in jail, or they can end up being incredibly successful as highly exploitative individuals. And that's often one that gets mistaken for narcissism too. Borderline personality disorder is also similar in a way, in that they're very dysregulated and they are impulsive and they do not do well with criticism or with rejection. And that can be overlapped with narcissism as well. Histrionic personality disorder, not as common, very rarely mistaken for narcissism, but just wanting to mention it as part of the cluster. It is someone that is self-centered, highly attention-seeking, quite overdramatic, and usually there's an element of sexual dysfunction, or I should say, I guess, seduction, so overuse of sex in their behaviors. I'm going to check the chat quickly. So I know I went through that really, really quickly because that's not the topic of conversation today, but I just wanted to shed light on the fact that before we jump to the assumption that a person is narcissistic or has NPD, we also need to understand that this is a psychiatric diagnosis. And under a diagnosis, there are criteria, there are tests, there are clusters, like I said, of symptoms that can be exhibited. So it's important to differentiate that. So now we've gotten through that. Next slide, I think, is going to be the DSM. Let's check what the next slide is. Perfect. So yep, this first one. So the reason I want to go through, this is very wordy, so don't worry about memorizing this or writing it down. You're not going to be tested. It's not for you to memorize. But the reason I want to mention the DSM is because I want to hone in on the fact that it is a diagnosis. There is a statistical manual that includes the criteria for what NPD is. We'll go through it step by step. I'll explain those words a little bit better. And then we'll distinguish this between someone who has traits. So DSM criteria for NPD. We need to also talk about how when you diagnose a personality disorder, you also need to exclude whether or not this disorder is because of a socially appropriate reaction or response. So we also need to make sure we're culturally safe, we have cultural humility, and understand that within different cultures, different adaptations are normal. They're good, right? They're necessary. So we don't want to be making snap judgments about someone because they're from a different background. So we don't want to over pathologize a personality. But there are criteria that need to be met, and if they are, we would diagnose it. So the first criteria is impairments in personality functioning. So that's in their inner world, and then impairments in their interpersonal functioning. So their external world, their world with others. In their inner world, there are two facets, either identity or self-direction. So in their identity, they generally don't have a rooted sense of self. It's not I am who I am because of who I am. It's I am who I am because of the world around me. So they need other individuals to regulate themselves, to define themselves. And often what you'll notice with someone with NPD is that their identity fluctuates constantly because of who they're around. So even around certain individuals, they'll be a different person. Over time, they will lose certain people in their life, develop a new group of friends or a new partner or a new world, and change their identity. So it's fluctuating. And then their self-direction. This one is hard to describe, but it's more so, I'll try to practically explain it, but the way that they set goals or the way that they try to achieve things is through the idea of what I'm going to get from other people. Like, what am I going to obtain from the world in doing what I'm doing? Not what is it going to do for me? So for most people, that sounds ridiculous because you're thinking, what do you mean? I'm doing things because I want to check. Yeah, you want to serve the world or you want to do good things for the world, but you also want to make sure that it's in line with what you believe in, what you love, and what you care about, right? But that's not something that a narcissistic person considers. They don't think about that. It's like I need to gain approval. I need to gain things from the world. I need to make the most money. I need to make the most money fast. I need to gloat about certain things or use this as a way of like showing off, if that makes sense as well. So often, and I'll give an example, often you'll see these individuals kind of jumping from an impulsive decision to another. So they might have this novel idea or invest a lot of money into something and then put everything they have into it and then succeed in it and then kind of drop it right away and move on to the next thing and try to like chase that high of being successful in something, but really for personal gain, like really just to be able to say like I did that. So it's usually unsustainable and impulsive. And then in the other impairment in interpersonal functioning, we have empathy and intimacy. So empathy is difficult because we don't know what a person is actually feeling, right? Unless they vocalize it. And what a person with narcissistic personality disorder will do is mirror other people. So they can be really good at pretending to be empathic or behaving empathically, but not genuinely being that. So I'll read it from what it says here. So it's an impaired ability to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. They're attuned to the reactions of others, but only because it's relevant to themselves. So only as an injury to themselves if the reaction is bad, and only as a self-gratifying experience if the reaction is good. And they definitely over or underestimate their effects on others. So underestimate meaning that they may be very, very harmful and feel like they have done nothing wrong. And overestimate meaning that they may be doing something that isn't particularly grand or helpful, but find that it is expect that it is the greatest thing that they had ever done for that person and expect a lot of reward for doing something. The empathy piece is really hard to validate with a person, but often you'll see because they lack empathy, they're generally do something called stonewalling. So they will be very cold and have minimal reaction to something that is actually quite emotional or turbulent or heartbreaking or sad, because they don't feel that way. They don't feel those emotions. And then you'll also notice that an individual with narcissistic personality disorder will pretend to have empathy or sadness or feel things towards others in scenarios where it's helpful to them. I hope I made that very clear. They will pretend and they will put on that face and they will mirror those emotions because in that scenario, it is helpful to them to behave that way. And then intimacy, this will be very hard again to know unless you have been in a romantic relationship with somebody or in a paternal relationship where obviously intimacy is different, but you in the family will know that they're not there to show love, compassion, to do, to have physical touch or components of physical love, unless it's gratifying for them. So unless it's for them. So relationships being largely superficial and serving their self-esteem, it's hard to explain. I guess I would say that a lot of the time a person with narcissistic personality disorder fulfills their needs through different relationships. So their marital relationship, their child-parent relationship, it will be for a particular purpose. So I want to prove that I am compassionate, I am kind, I am charismatic through my partner because they are those things. And that's what that relationship serves. It serves as an identity mirroring. So I can see them as who they are, but if I'm tied to them, if I'm married to them, or if I'm with them, if I'm connected to them, then I will also be seen that way by the public. That's kind of their mentality. So it's superficial in that sense, in that they specifically seek certain individuals in their life that they mirror and that they would like to be represented by in the world. And yes, again, the theme of personal gain will come up time and time again, that they're not genuinely interested in the individual. They are expecting gain. So gain through status, money, image, like their public image, things like that. I hope so far that has made sense. Next slide. There's a lot of criteria. So the next criteria are a little bit more exclusionary, which means like, it can't be this, it can't be this, but I'll finish up the last criteria. So that there's a pathological personality trait in the following domain, and it's called antagonism in the DSM, characterized by grandiosity and attention seeking. And this will appear when the narcissistic person's ego has been damaged, or they have met a wall in their continuous pursuit of exploiting individuals or harming individuals. When they're met with resistance, this is who comes out, the antagonist. So they can be highly charismatic and lovely and put on a show, but once they're met with resistance, this is what happens. So the grandiosity is the feeling of entitlement, either overt or covert. I'll explain that later on. Self-centered, firmly holding on to the belief that they are better than others and they are condescending towards others. And then the other side, which is attention seeking. So this one is hard to explain because a lot of people will say, well, I can't believe that person has narcissistic traits. They actually don't show themselves on social media, or they don't talk about their accomplishments very much, or they're not very, they don't seem attention seeking. Well, they're not always attention seeking in that way. It's in different ways, where attention seeking will be through direct interactions with individuals, where they will be self-deprecating and will ask for a lot of emotional support from individuals, where they will take your time and drain your energy, therefore are seeking your attention almost on a constant basis. It's exhausting, really, at that point. But it doesn't have to be in a very like large scale where they're the classic narcissist where they're, you know, have millions of followers on social media and they post themselves every day. They don't have to be that to be attention seeking. Attention seeking can be in your day-to-day activities on a smaller scale. I feel like I'll get questions on that, so I'll leave whatever specific things you guys want to know about that till later. And then the next criteria, like I said, is that it's not because of a medical condition or a drug, a substance-induced type of thing, and it's not normal for their socio-cultural background. We have to always include that in order to be culturally safe and humility as psychiatrists. I also wanted to mention that a lot of narcissistic individuals and folks with NPD have a comorbid. Comorbid means existing alongside the NPD diagnosis, mental health condition. They'll often have anxiety or depression and substance use problems. So just because they have a substance use problem doesn't mean that they don't have narcissistic personality disorder. It's that the disorder didn't come from the substance use. It didn't result from it, if that makes sense. But they can coexist. So those are the DSM criteria. I know it's a lot, but we can go to the next slide. Okay, before I go to causes, maybe it would be good to go to the next slide first. There, okay, and then we'll go back to causes. So I want to pose this question first and say, what does it mean now to just have the traits and not have a full-blown disorder? And I want to explain this very clearly. Anyone can have traits of any personality disorder. So from any of the clusters. I'll speak for myself personally. I know that I have likely obsessive compulsive personality disorder traits. I definitely have traits. I even have anxious personality disorder traits. I know in myself that when I read the DSM criteria, I'm thinking, oh, I check that box and I check that box. That doesn't mean that you have a disorder. Those traits have not impacted the ability of that person to function and to operate in the world. And they have not likely damaged relationships or their occupation, their job, their education, and etc. But it doesn't mean that they're not harmful in some capacity. So we have to hold both truths, that you don't have a full-blown disorder. It's not impacting your daily life, your job, your career, your relationships, but it does harm them in some way. I hope that makes sense. It's like saying, well, you know, I eat sugar every single day at a very high amount. Like I drink 3 Cokes a day. I haven't lost my job or my friendships or my relationships, but I have headaches all the time. I don't sleep very well. I have to work really hard to manage my day-to-day life, but it hasn't impacted me, but it's definitely a bad habit that I need to change. So let's talk about narcissistic traits and we'll go back to causes. So I think the next slide has some explanation there that I can talk about. Okay, so narcissistic subtypes I'll talk about in a second. So what does having traits mean? Having traits means that those DSM criteria I mentioned manifest but are not fully there altogether and has not been formally diagnosed. And I want to explain again, folks with NPD, actual NPD, do not go see psychiatrists. So we don't diagnose it very much. So pretty much everyone, we have to just say, has traits. We can't say they have it unless they've seen a psychiatrist or psychologist and have been formally diagnosed. And that's the caveat with dealing with a narcissist, because they don't get help. They're not the problem. Everyone else is, right? So that's important to mention. So when we talk about traits, I also wanted to talk about subtypes. And this is not a psychiatric separation or classification. This is, I believe, in psychology. So I want to clarify that it's on the DSM. These subtypes are very important to know, because this is where people start to doubt what narcissism is or get confused, because they say, well, how could that person have been a narcissist? They are so charismatic and they're a philanthropist. They donate money. They're very religious. They're very quiet to themselves. Yes, they can still be a narcissist, period. they can still have traits. They can still be narcissistic. They can still be abusive. They can still be, etc. Like the list goes on. And I want to explain that through these subtypes. So there's the grandiose narcissism, the vulnerable narcissism, and malignant. And some people will call it covert and overt. It doesn't matter what you use, whatever classification you like, go for it. I kind of liked this one. So the grandiose narcissist is the one that has unrealistic and an inflated sense of superiority. This one is more classic, more, entitled, overconfident, exploits others a lot, is hostile, aggressive. Generally, probably this person is a boss. This person is a CEO. The vulnerable, and everyone hates them, is afraid of them. The vulnerable narcissist is someone that is a little bit more low key. Those ones actually end up in religious institutions. They end up showing a very pretty face and a very, gentle, calm, compassionate face in front of others. But they're the ones who have a very reduced sense of self-identity, self-esteem, and are very vulnerable to when receiving criticism or pushback. And then that surfaces, the antagonism I was talking about earlier, comes out, and they become very toxic, very toxic, very fast. And these are the ones that also have a very deep-rooted sense of shame and even can be introverted. They can also be very suspicious of others, which is something I should mention as well with narcissistic personality disorder, is that when you, at your core, generally are a trustworthy, honest person, you don't generally carry around the suspicion that others are constantly trying to harm you or exploit you, or, in general, like that they're not trustworthy. But when you have that in you, I think you generally have the suspicion that others are like that too. So they often are suspicious that people are stealing from them, watching them, looking to exploit them or their family, etc. The malignant narcissist is the more understandable type, I guess, but they're not as common. Probably because evolution was like, no, you cannot survive in society being a malignant narcissist because it's just so impossible. People don't deal with you, but they still exist. Definitely, they still do. I feel as though I would like to say, being in psychiatry and being in medicine, a malignant narcissist would be like a surgeon. And I'll explain why. So they're good at what they do, but they can, yes, be malicious, yes, be manipulative, but they are highly successful. And I don't know how else to explain this, but they just succeed in their particular niche of work, but have this grandiosity, this aggression to them, superiority, and God complex. Astaghfirullah, I don't want to actually, say that somebody is, but they have that complex in themselves. So I guess now that explains kind of the traits. And then I'd like to go back about causes, because I feel like that would be important if we can go back to okay. I think this question came up in the last talk. And I think it's important to talk about. So the reasons I like to have people understand where it comes from it is definitely to be empathic and compassionate, absolutely. But it isn't to say that you excuse the behavior or you neglect to address the behavior or you don't hold a person accountable. It's for the purposes of understanding, period. And then you can do with that information what you'd like, right? So it's a bit of a contentious issue, but I'll go through some of the reasons why people have speculated people become narcissistic. So number one, I would say, is genetics. Genetics for two reasons. One, that of course, if a person has NPD in your family, you're more likely genetically to develop it, but also because of the learned behavior of having that person in your life, right? Obviously, the genetics and the behavior come together, but if you have the genetics, you obviously saw the behavior. You learned it. You learned that the person in your family that has narcissistic personality disorder behave differently in public than they were at home. You learned that they were charismatic and loving and compassionate outside, but abusive inside. You learned that you were demoralized privately, but talked about very highly publicly. You had to understand the dichotomy. I mean, you didn't even understand it. It makes no sense. It's not understandable. You had to work through this dichotomy, and then as a child, you learned it. You learn to become that. There's so many other things that happen in homes, like with narcissistic parents, like scapegoating children, having like a golden child, a scapegoat child, physical abuse, verbal abuse, lots of different forms of abuse that you would have witnessed as a child, right? So it's not, I can't just, I can't share all of it, but I'm just saying in general, you saw it, you learned it. And then moving on to other things that people have speculated. So excessive praise. This one, I would sort of give an example of in a family where a child can do no wrong, where they're perfect, even if they're not, no one is, where they're perfect and they've done no wrong, even if they've done some pretty crappy things. No, it wasn't my child's fault, it was everybody else. Well, when you instill that into them, they're going to believe it, and they're going to believe it for the rest of their lives. And they become narcissists who say, not me, it's everyone else. And then like I said, they don't end up seeking support because it's never their fault. The world's fault, it's never their fault. So that's one way. Other things are neglect as well. So neglect and lack of care and trauma does the opposite effect. So for some people, the neglect and the trauma will make you softer, more compassionate, maybe more of an empath. But the way that this child, and for whatever reason we can't explain, coped with that trauma was to blame the world, was to not look inward, was to become hardened, was to become more aggressive and more entitled to good things rather than the opposite, which an empath is kind of literally the opposite, where they believe they don't deserve it, or they believe they're at fault and they kind of go inward. They develop the opposite reaction. That goes the same to say with manipulative or toxic parents, inconsistent parenting. Again, these things are all trauma that lead to empathic individuals. But in this case, the way that this person coped, was by developing more of a sense of entitlement and grandiosity. And like I said, the aggression and all of that. And then parental overindulgence. I don't really know what that means, but I think that kind of goes with the same idea of making your child feel like they're always a victim of circumstance and that the world is always the problem and that they're perfect. Not to say that you shouldn't tell your child that they're amazing and wonderful and you should encourage them and support them, but that children should also understand what it means to be accountable and kind and gentle and fair, right? Like these are all important, but I don't think that children who grew up in homes, I don't believe that people who become narcissists grew up in homes where those were even discussed. They didn't talk about fairness or equity or accountability or kindness. That just wasn't a thing, more often than not. Next section. Okay, so I wrote this down because I really need to stress this like over and over again, because people will say to me like, why am I in therapy? Like my partner should be, or my mom should be, or my dad should be, or whatever. Like the person who's a narcissist should be. And it's like, I know, I really know, but they're not. And they're probably never going to be. That's a reality that we have to accept without really, like, it's really difficult. With a hard heart, we accept that. Because we want them to be well, right? For more people who, for people who have someone in their life that has NPD, and they love them, they want them to be better. They want them to have healthy relationships and to be more stable and functional. But it's rare. It's almost as like, I don't even know the percentage. It's very rare that they will end up getting help. They may seek help for things, like I said before, the depression and anxiety and substance use, but they still will at their root not believe they have anything wrong with them in terms of a personality disorder or in terms of harming others. And then sometimes in those meetings, like when a person is depressed or anxious or has substance use problems, the psychologist or psychiatrist will notice those traits because they'll notice the obvious like trail of destruction. that this person has in their life, their failed relationships, their sense of entitlement to others. Like, they will notice it, but they can't do anything about it if the person in front of them doesn't acknowledge it too. Like, you can only heal the parts of you that you've accepted, acknowledged, or believe in, and they don't. So then how are we meant to heal that? So this part of the talk is very heavy for most because it's kind of, I don't want it to be like you can never ever be okay with it, but often the work comes from the people around the narcissist, unfortunately. Next slide. Okay, so this is where we get to the coping section. So I'm going to try to finish by 12:45 because I wanted to have ample time for questions. Like last time I didn't have any, so I tried to really time myself. So we have a lot of time. So ask any questions you want. So how can you cope with that person then? Now that we've talked about the DSM, the criteria, we talked about the traits, we talked about the subtypes, how are you supposed to deal with this? And I want to first preface this by saying, if there is a risk of physical and sexual and other types of abuse where you are in danger for your life and your safety, these don't work. And I reiterated that the last time. These do not work. If you need to leave, you need to leave. If you're not safe, you need to leave. These are the types of coping strategies I provide for individuals who are, in co-parenting relationships with a narcissist, who have a narcissistic parent that they may no longer live with, but they're still trying to preserve the relationship the best way they can, etc. So like, please accept that sometimes you just need to get out because you're not safe. So how can you cope? First thing is establish boundaries. Second thing, and I'll flesh these out more, do not overshare. Remember that you're not at fault. Trust yourself over what they say, because there's a lot of gaslighting and minimizing and blaming. Like I said, in the narcissist mind, they're never wrong. The world is wrong. So you will never be, accepted for your truth, but trust yourself. Don't take anything personally to deal with a narcissist. Seek support from others and talk to others and consult a therapist if possible. So let's talk about the boundaries. One, so establishing boundaries can be, for example, if a narcissistic parent in your life feels entitled to access to you 24/7, can come show up at your house anytime, call you anytime, call you while you're at work, show up while you're working, like do whatever they want to you, which is generally what they think. It's establishing the boundary of saying, I really want you around, or I want you around the kids, but I need you to tell me before you come. I'd like you to give me a notice, or I'd like you to let me know which days, and we can plan it in advance so that you can be mentally, physically, and emotionally prepared, right? Like sometimes we need that preparation. And also buffer time between when you see them, to say, hey, I actually can't do anything between this day and this day. I can see you on this day, period. And for some people, it's flabbergasting because you're like, I can't say that to my mom. What are you talking about? No, you can. You can. It will hurt, and you will probably be guilty after, and you will feel bad, but you can. It's not a matter of can't. Other establishment of boundaries, if you're co-parenting, is saying things like, we are not to speak outside of our conversations that are essential for the kids or for the family, period. I don't wish for you to come anytime earlier or later than the time we agreed on for pickup, period, etc. The list goes on and on. We can give more examples if you guys have specific questions, but I hope that is clear. It's establishing the boundaries for their access to you, physical and emotional. Because emotional is also, when they're not around you, they still think they have control over you, but it's establishing the boundary of even the emotional access to you. And that's where the not oversharing comes in. So people with narcissistic traits will use what you say against you often. So when you share with them or are vulnerable with them, you might feel good in that moment, but then you might learn over time that vulnerability led to them hurting you the exact way that you shared that hurt you, or them using it against you and harming you even more, really. So generally people will tell me that over time they stop sharing things with them and they become very superficial because it's a coping strategy. Your mind recognized it on its own and you didn't even know it was doing it, but some people need to actively do it. So see how you're going with that experience, but some people need to actively not share with them because they know it's going to backfire. Sorry, but others were just like, over time, I stopped because I couldn't do it anymore. It just hurt me. Remembering that you're not at fault, trusting yourself over the narcissist, those are pretty self-explanatory. You'll be blamed for everything that's bad, but you shouldn't be. Oh, this presentation disappeared. But you shouldn't be blamed for it. And remember that not everything is your fault. I mean, definitely some things we are at fault for and some things we do that are wrong, but in the narcissistic world, you are the problem, not them. And then the seeking support is very important too. So even if, I'll give the example of somebody who moved out of their home or ended the relationship with a narcissist, for example, and they're no longer in that experience, but they have to either heal from it or they have to still interact with that person because of, you know, court situations or children or family, or whatever. And even in that case, have support, like have a therapist that you can check in with and say, okay, how am I doing with my boundaries? Or how can I say this to them? And they will guide you. Like have someone that just walks you through or walks alongside you through your navigating the healing process and this newfound establishment of your own power, right? Like you establishing yourself, which you probably didn't do before if you were in that, you know, if you accepted the abuse or you just had to tolerate it. Next slide. I want to mention one thing before we get to questions, which is called gray rocking. And this is talked about a lot on social media. Gray rocking is a spectacular way to describe interacting with a narcissist. It is becoming literally a rock. It is like becoming nothing. You become boring, you become uninteresting, you don't continue, you don't engage in their attempt at riling you up or gaslighting you or hurting you because they know how to, of course. It's not engaging. It's like responding literally with, okay, that's it. Keep the interaction short, communicate with no emotion. Do not use emotional words, just facts, and then maintain your privacy. And you'll notice how quickly a narcissist will stop talking to you when you do that, because you're no longer a form of a supply for them. You know, they need supply in the form of good and bad supply. Bad supply is harming other people, making them angry, hurting them, and they can't do that to you anymore. And they also can't do the opposite, where they get a positive reaction out of you. So it's like, what am I doing here? What's the point? I don't need to be here. And they lose interest, and that's generally a very good sign. That's a successful sign. So yeah, become very boring and don't engage. There's one more slide, I think, as well. I don't remember. Yeah, more coping strategies. So I wanted to show this one because number 2, encourage them to seek treatment. Now, I want to caution you against these self-help tools online and things like that, because for a lot of us, if we were to tell the narcissist in our lives that they're a narcissist, things would not go well. It would not be a good thing. We would end up in a lot of harm, and in fact. So encouraging them to seek treatment, okay, cool. Like, depending on how safe you feel with that person, you can try, but I don't recommend it. I just don't. I recommend that you seek the help that you need. I recommend that you get support. I recommend that all the energy that you've been throwing at this person and this relationship, you take it and you direct it inward. You set your boundaries. You protect yourself. You are not responsible for their bad behavior. You need to care for yourself. And if with time, and if in the chance that you have that the person in your life will admit it, absolutely, then talk about it. But I don't want to set an expectation that a narcissist would admit they're a narcissist, because that does not happen. Next section or next slide. Okay, this is for fun. I mean, not really for fun. It's kind of sad, but this is just to talk about why narcissism is not just excluded to our families and our friends. It's actually our job. So I mentioned earlier, like surgeons are often very narcissistic individuals, but kind of in an adaptive way, right? You don't want to have a conversation with your surgeon about your emotions. You want to have them be a good surgeon. And so their sense of grandiosity and entitlement and complex of being superior works in their job. Similar to corporate management, CEOs, and leadership, they will often take up those positions. So they're kind of all around us, unfortunately. So just important to mention, so that these tools and strategies can be used at work. They can be used in any context, not just within your relationships outside of work. And that was it. Let's talk about questions. I'm sorry I kind of flew through everything. I do apologize. I just really wanted to have time for you all to share your questions.
Shukran so much. Please check your phone. The questions will come through in just a moment.
Okay, I will.
So first.
And I'll just take a breather. First of all, was that really fast for anybody, or was that okay for the pace? If you want to share in the chat. Oh, it's disabled. Never mind.
Oh, it has been sent you now, so. It was sent via email, by the way.
Oh, my email. Sorry, I was checking WhatsApp. Okay. Okay. Oh, wow. Okay, there's a lot. Okay, I'm going to do my best to answer them. How come the DSM only seems to discuss the criteria for overt NPD as opposed to both overt and covert? Yeah, beautiful. That's an amazing question. The reason that it doesn't cover both the overt and covert, more vulnerable, introverted narcissistic personality disorder folks is because the DSM is a manual of diagnoses that impact a person's level of function in their day-to-day. So often a person with NPD a person with narcissistic traits can kind of get through life without these major impacts to their relationships or their job or their education, but they're still very harmful. I'm not minimizing that. And that's why it's hard, because the DSM is so strict on the fact that it has to impact your life. And it's the same with anxiety and depression, right? Like you can meet so many criteria for anxiety and depression, but be very high functioning, but you don't fit the criteria. So it's really awful. I don't like the system and I want it to change, but that's the reason why. Okay, so I will try to reword this question because I feel like it would like to be left anonymous. So someone in their life does not accept responsibility and does not accept confrontation. And when they're confronted, they get violent and they bring up your past when they're confronted. What do we do when the wife of that person refuses them to go to a doctor or psychiatrist for help? I mean, that's just basic. What's the word? When you allow someone to keep behaving a certain way, like when you just accept that behavior and you even kind of encourage it. I don't know what the word is. I'm losing it from it's on the tip of my tongue, but I don't know the word. A lot of the time, a person with narcissistic personality disorder continues and stays who they are because they have not been held accountable by anyone in their life, and they've been, in fact, encouraged. And so this just gives me, like, it's another example of that even though this person, this wife or partner to a person who clearly has a problem, even though they might recognize the issue and even though they might accept it as an issue, they are complacent and don't wish to have anything changed or don't wish to engage in that kind of conversation. They themselves might be traumatized. Like, they themselves might be traumatized or be exhausted or tired, and can no longer engage in any meaningful support. And what your role is in that process is really not much. Like, how can you change the mind of someone who is not wishing to change their own life or change their own circumstances? I wish I had better advice, but I think, again, like I said at the end of the talk, preserve your own energy, create your own boundaries, protect yourself. You are not responsible for the safety and protection of others. If you've already addressed it with that person and you already raised your concerns about their safety and their well-being, you have done your part and you are welcome to keep trying. But I don't know if it's something that I would engage in long-term. It's draining and exhausting for you. And in that case as well, if you also feel that there is an element of neglect or abuse towards the person or the children, you can also report that. I have to say that legally, please report it. How are narcissistic traits viewed in the light of ostentation and riya? I do have to preface that I'm not an Islamic scholar and I don't know how I can answer this question. If there is someone in the audience or someone who is part of the Muslims Connected team who wants to contribute to that conversation, you're welcome to, but I do apologize. I don't have Islamic knowledge to answer a question like this in a meeting of this size.
That's okay. We actually will be having a session on Riya, so you can maybe ask that question in that session, inshallah.
Oh, amazing. Can I know when you're having that session?
Yes, it's actually on this Friday. I think it's, this coming Friday, inshallah.
This Friday. Okay, so there's a discussion on that this Friday, so please ask that question. And with your knowledge of what the traits are, you can also share that knowledge with the folks in the meeting too. Okay. Someone asked how someone gets narcissism. I hope I answered that question. There is a tendency when learning about narcissism that is a disorder born from trauma, and that's something that they cannot truly help having since it occurred at a very young age and they were not aware of it. Yet narcissists know that some of the actions they're doing are wrong and hurtful, yet they continue to do them. That is correct. How do we strike a balance between understanding that the narcissist has a disorder, yet they are still responsible for their actions? To me, it's very hard to have empathy for someone who continues to hurt and abuse. I love this question. You're right. There are moments in a person with NPD where they will admit or apologize or say, I did this and I hurt you and I was wrong. Yes. But I also want to step back and allow you all to look at the pattern. So that will happen. But the pattern is generally that even after that happens, they go back to harming and abusing. They go back to doing the same things they were doing before. And they go back to saying that it was your fault or that it was XYZ's fault or it wasn't them, it was, again, the world. So I think it's important to remember that even in those brief moments of awareness, there's never accountability. There's never change, right? And even if there is change, again, someone in the audience might say, well, yeah, my narcissistic partner changed for 3 days. That's not change, right? That's putting on a show. That's a performance. So it's hard to have empathy. I hear you. It is very hard to empathize with someone who has narcissistic personality disorder or traits. And I kind of did want to explain that at the beginning when I tried to explain the reasons for the disorder the personality disorder, in not making you take away your empathy and compassion, but also not making you take away your accountability and your honesty and your self-preservation and protection. So again, the same theme arises. Preserve yourself. You are not responsible for their change. You are not responsible for their well-being, and you're not responsible for their actions. That's not on you. So go back and focus inward. You can still have compassion for them if you want, but you are not responsible for their decisions. So strike the balance between understanding them in knowing that your responsibility is to yourself, is to protect your body and yourself. And that is an Islamic responsibility too, right? We are expected to protect and preserve ourselves as well. Our body has, we have that duty, to our body. Can the 3 subtypes of narcissism overlap? I'm sure they could. I don't know if malignant could as much because it is a very, very specific and extreme subtype, but I suppose the subtypes of the covert, the vulnerable and the other types can definitely overlap. Okay, I want to move on to how can you know if you're a narcissist, and how do you live above this and be better? So I didn't talk about the treatment options for NPD in this conversation because I didn't know if that was what everybody wanted, but there are treatment options, and there's actually quite a bit of research out of the States. I don't know the organization off the top of my head, but where they actually do have folks with diagnosed NPD and they're under treatment, like they're receiving treatment. So it is a thing. Like I said, it's rare, but it happens. And there's specific therapists that will be skilled in managing individuals that are narcissistic. And so there's therapy, psychological and psychiatric therapy. There's even medications because, sorry, like I said, there's a lot of overlap between NPD and anxiety, depression, and substance use. So you can receive treatment and medication for the comorbid conditions, and that will also help you improve your disorder, like your personality disorder, because it helps you improve your emotional regulation, your coping strategies, and allow you to actually be more inward thinking, and improve in your own emotional capacity, right? So I definitely think that therapy is the first step, going to a doctor, therapist, psychiatrist, and saying, I think I have this, I have that, I'd like to get some support, and hearing their opinion first, having somebody else share their thoughts with you and what they recommend for you. You can absolutely get better. So I didn't want to make it seem like narcissistic personality disorder is the end of the world for a person. It's certainly not. But because of the statistics we know, they often don't change. That's why I said that. But if they're willing to, that's a totally different story, right? If they accept it and they're willing to, that's a different world. There was another question that was very long and shared a lot of detail, and I don't want to share all the detail for anonymity purposes. Can this person change? The same thing I just said applies. So if there is an acceptance, right? No change comes from not accepting, acknowledging, or understanding yourself, right? So if they accept it, acknowledge it, and say, yes, this is true for me, then we can move forward. But getting from nothing to acceptance, that's the journey. Like, that's the problem. We just don't get there. It's so hard. So with a narcissist, like actually getting them to admit, acknowledge, and accept who they are, or who they are perceived by the world, is so hard. Because for them, their perception of themselves is that they are not that person, right? So it's all about that journey to acceptance. And then from there, change is absolutely possible. But let me tell you, getting to acceptance is hard. Which methods can one instill in a child with a narcissistic parent? I suppose you mean like coping strategies, all of them, every single one of them that I talked about. Boundaries, gray rocking, be very uninteresting to your parents. Even if they're your parents, you can become a gray rocker. Still be uninteresting. Don't engage in their tactics of manipulation, of gaslighting, of control. You don't have to. That's not love. And within my very limited capacity as a Muslim, I'm just a Muslim. Like, I don't claim to be anything more. You don't owe your parents your sanity and your safety and your well-being. You owe yourself that. You owe your body and your mind that self-preservation. You can love your parents and not be a slave to their emotional abuse. You don't have to. That's not Islamic. Like, it's not an Islamic principle to force yourself to be abused because you have to love your parents. No, you are not meant to do that. That is not an Islamic ideology. That's not an Islamic practice. You are allowed to preserve yourself, create your boundaries, emotional and physical, and do all the other things we talked about today. So this question was about emotionally abusive ex-partners towards the children. How do I settle with this heartbreak? This kind of actually does go off of what I just said. So this idea of respecting your parents, because you have to, even though you are emotionally destructive towards your children as a parent, like, sorry, if the parent is emotionally destructive to the child. And I am a firm believer in not engaging with your parent who was abusive to you. I can't stress that enough. There is nowhere in Islam that tells you that you need to tolerate abuse and that respect equals tolerating abuse. It does not. It never has. So I think in this case, I'm also very concerned that the abuse is towards the children. And therefore, I would say either creating boundaries for their safety. So creating boundaries on where the children and the father or mother or whoever are together are created. So like who's going to be around them, limiting, because oftentimes a narcissist will not abuse people in front of others. So creating boundaries on where they go, who's around them, how the interactions are had. And finally, reporting it, getting people involved, like social workers, therapists, and other people who can do the monitoring for you, because you do not have to bear the burden on your own. So definitely consider that as well in the future, because your children's lives are incredibly valuable. They don't deserve to be abused. And especially not in the name of Islam. Like that's heartbreaking to me, to say that I should be abused because I'm Muslim and I have to respect my parents. Like that to me is just heartbreaking. How much longer do we have? Can we go on a bit more or?
It's really up to you. We are at the end of the hour, so it's up to you if you have time.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm happy to try to answer some more. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so there's more questions here about dealing with a narcissist, verbally and emotionally abusive parent from an Islamic perspective. I know, again, I just said what I said, but I hope Muslims Connected, you get somebody to talk about this. My capacity is so limited. I'm in psychiatry. I am not an Islamic scholar, and I do not feel comfortable giving that advice, but I really would love that to be a topic of conversation for folks, because abuse from parents is just so common, unfortunately, and we just force children to suffer, and it's heartbreaking because they shouldn't. You're a child. You deserve respect. You deserve support. You deserve, at the bare minimum, not to be abused. Forget even all the extra things, but bare minimum, you don't deserve to be abused. So this question really breaks my heart. And I really wish I could advise you in an Islamic perspective, but I can't. But I can advise you from me as a human being and a doctor. I would say that you do not need to interact or engage with somebody, even if they are your parent, because they are abusing you, and that is harmful. And you will be held accountable for your body and your mind and your soul. Like we're held accountable to them. So I think self-preservation and protection are paramount in that scenario. And one other thing about boundaries that I'd like to talk about is, I was actually listening to Dr. Dania Awad before I came here today. She was speaking at the Muslim Mental Health Conference, and she was talking about the Islamic theologies and psychology perspectives from back in the day regarding goal setting and boundaries and substance use and OCD. There is a very long practice of psychological self-preservation of the mind, body, and soul. Like not just the mind that we think about today, but of the soul. That is so beautiful, and that is part of our tradition. It's not something that is like new and novel, created by the white man in the West. It's very much integral and part of our Islamic understanding. So I highly encourage that we share resources about that with folks when it comes to parents, because we still have this idea that you have to stay in their relationship or in their home and be abused by them. And I don't believe in that. As a society, how can we teach, inform, and warn future generations about the possibility of lurking narcissists? Seems like there's a lack of awareness of NPD traits among teens and young adults, thus leading them to fall into webs and traps of narcissists. That is so true. How can we inform them individually? Like, this is what we're doing right now. Like, do it. Like, do this. Talk about it. Be honest about who is abusive, or especially, in like positions of power. Like, be honest about those things. Share those stories. Advocate for the victims and survivors. Share content online. Like, you never know how far a post on Instagram or Twitter or TikTok goes. Share information with folks. Children are very active on social media. tailoring the content to them is also really helpful, which I try to do so much with my Instagram. I try to make the content very bite-sized, very quick, very easy to consume, because children have very short attention spans. And for me, even a child is like a 12-year-old, an 11-year-old, I want them to read this. I want them to know this. Anything above the age of like 14, 15, I would say is more like young adults. But I think they really do understand it and they grasp it when you just tell them this information, but share it in a way that it is kind of more universally or globally understood. And I think that they're the most likely to become victims of narcissistic abuse is these young folks. So you're protecting them and teaching them all at once. And I agree with you that they don't really have an awareness. And often might even believe that someone who's very charismatic and funny and charming is a good person. But we also need to explain to them that a person can behave that way publicly and be very abusive privately. So it's important not to make them paranoid or suspicious, but to make them aware and always be cautious and critical, like to be critical of other people. That's an important trait to instill in our young people. Okay, the last question I'm going to answer, there's a lot here and they're very long, so I don't know if I can do all of them. I'm going to do one last question. I want to apologize to all of the ones I couldn't answer. Let's start with, actually, I'll do two more. So is it okay to exhibit gray rocking and still live with a narcissistic ex? So insert parent, husband, wife, sibling. And the answer is yes, you can. I don't recommend that you do it forever. I've seen it. I've actually seen it personally. I've seen what it looks like for a partner to be gray rocking and live with a partner indefinitely. And the risk with that is, or not indefinitely, I mean, obviously we're still alive and we're still here. So like it's present day, but the risk is that you lose access to your emotions. You lose access to your reactions and even sometimes become ambivalent to things that might happen to children in the home or to other people in the home. So other people that visit or see you or come to the house and interact with the narcissistic person in your life. And you don't want that forever. You don't want to lose access to your feelings, especially not long-term. And you don't want to lose access to like defending yourself or holding that person accountable forever. That's a different type of like almost deadness. You're kind of just dead inside. And I think even when children watch that, especially long-term, like I said, gray rocking in bursts, like little episodes with the person you have to talk to is fine. But when you do it forever and children are there watching you and seeing it, they think that that's okay. And they might believe that they should just behave like that forever as well with someone who's abusing them or hurting them. And I don't think I want that to be the message, right? I don't want children to think that that's what they should be doing. So certainly you can do it. The question was, is it okay? I can't tell you that. I'm not a moral judge. But I don't think that I would not recommend that you do it forever. I think that there is a time when you have to leave and you know when to leave, and there's wisdom in that and protection in that. The last question I'm going to answer is about resources. So I wish there were more resources to help estranged adult Muslim children in dealing with their unrelenting, covert NPD mother, as well as a trauma-bonded, enabling, orbiting father. The question goes on. I don't want to say too much again for anonymity purposes, but essentially the parents are kind of like, they feed off each other. So if you have a narcissistic parent, the other one might be a very enabling person. And that was the word I was looking for before, that the person who was talking about the wife of a narcissist before is that's what enabling is, right? Like that's why we don't stop the transmission of narcissistic personality disorder, is because we continue to have enablers in the journey. So they continue with their narcissistic personality disorder behavior, the children adopt it, they do it, the children adopt it. It just continues intergenerationally because of enabling. So classically as well, in a relationship, there might be an enabler and a narcissistic person. And so this person is describing that and wanting resources for that. I find that they may not change. I will try and get them the resources to help one or both of them see their effect on their children. but some families just may go no contact. I don't want to forsake them. I need a trauma-informed NPD aware Muslim therapist in Toronto. Any guidance is welcome. Sorry. So we can talk about this. I'm in the GTA, like I'm in the Greater Toronto area. So I do know a lot of Muslim therapists here in the area. I would recommend Wellness Therapy and Cedar Way Therapy. Those are two places to have Muslim therapists. And I would recommend the Khalil Center. I don't know if you've tried those three places. Can I type them in the chat possibly? No. What I can do is on my Instagram, I can share a Muslim therapist in Toronto and I can like make a story about it. But also if you go to my story highlights and you go to my question and answer section, I have a section on finding Muslim therapists, and it's like websites after website where you can search for them and you can search criteria for narcissistic parents, abuse, things like that. And it will formulate a list of therapists that will be able to cater to that. So it's a matter of searching and a matter of also dedicating time to calling, like create a short list, for example, of like 3 therapists that you think would be good for you. Call them up and say, I need help with this. Can you help me? Yes or no? And then ask them how much it costs, all of that. Next person, ask them the same questions, and then compare the therapist and pick one that is good for you. Like you're going to be using your time, your energy, your money. So choose wisely and be very selective. Like choose who's good for you. And luckily in the GTA, we're very blessed, alhamdulillah, to have so many options for Muslim therapists. Like it's an abundance. So I think you'll be completely okay finding one. Parts of the world do not share that, but my story highlight, my Q&A section, I know for a fact has a list of websites that you can use to find a therapist that is Muslim. And with that, I think I'm not going to be able to answer the rest of the questions. I'm so sorry. I wish I could. But I did dedicate a lot of time. So I hope that I answered enough questions for today. Oh, I got more questions. Hopefully we can do this again. I'd love to join again and talk more about this and be of support for the community. But we covered a lot today. So I think we should all take a nice deep breath. And this was a heavy conversation. So I hope that you take the time to look after yourself after this.
Shukran, Jazakallah khairan for your time, for sharing your time and your expertise with us. It really was very enlightening, and I'm sure it was healing for many people. It can be healing just to be informed and just to come to the realization sometimes for people. So I hope that, everyone who attended has benefited in some way. Alhamdulillah. Okay, so with that, I don't know, somebody's just shared their screen. Can you please, I don't know what's happening yet. What's on the screen?
I don't know what that is.
Okay. Okay, I think I've stopped it now. Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, and also I just wanted to say to the audience as well that I saw there were some questions about trauma bonds. So Dr. Nahla did do a presentation the last time about trauma bonds. So if you missed that, then please go and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's just called Muslims Connected, and you will find that presentation on YouTube. So go back and watch that. To everyone who registered today, you will also get the recording of today's session. So if you need to go back to it, you can always, just go watch the replay, the recording of it. And we do apologize as well to everyone whose questions were not answered. Unfortunately, it's just impossible to get through all the questions. But Jazakallah khairan, shukran, Dr. Nahla, for again your time and your expertise and for answering all the questions that you did and for going a bit over time as well. We really appreciate it. And with that, again, shukran. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Just want to speak to the attendees now. So next session will be on Riya, which is ostentation, which means showing off in Islam. So it's going to be about understanding what Riya is, what the different forms of Riya are, how it affects the heart, how it impacts acts of worship, and the cures for that. And that's going to be presented by one of my teachers here in Egypt, actually, Dr. Hisham Hilia. So you can sign up for that. The information will be sent in all of the WhatsApp groups and also you can, I'm sure once the post is ready, it will go out onto all of our social media platforms. So again, if you're not following us on Instagram, please do. And you can follow Dr. Nahla as well if you're not already following her, because she does have a lot of resources and information that you would be interested in. And we're always here if you have any topic suggestions or any speaker suggestions. Please reach out to us and feel free to give us any feedback. Okay, then that's all from me for tonight. Subhanakallahumma bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.